Good day, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are at the moment. But wish you all a good day today and fruitful day. I am Mohammed Ghali. Mohammed Ghali. I am the acting director of the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, CILE. This is the acronym, how we call it. I'm very happy to welcome you all as speakers, participants, attendants, and colleagues in this new edition of the summer school of our research center under the title Ethics in Sports or Sport Ethics. And today I was supposed to just give the introductory remarks in my capacity as the acting director of the research center. But it seems my role will be a little bit more extended because my colleague, Dr. Ray Jureidini, who was in touch with all of you the last period to organize this event, unfortunately, he caught COVID just a day or two before, and he is now in a poor health condition in the hospital. He said he will do his best to join us whenever he feels okay. So we may still see him in the rest of today or tomorrow. I wish him speed recovery and to be back with us soon. So I will start say a few things about the event and our research center, and then I will say some few words about the summer school on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Ray Jureidini. Our research center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, or CILE, is specialized in Islamic ethics. In the research center, we conduct research on Islamic ethics, and we approach the emerging field of Islamic ethics from an interdisciplinary perspective. So we study ethics in the Islamic tradition in the broadest sense of the term. So we study ethics in the different scholarly disciplines from within Islam, like Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic theology, philosophy, Sufism, adab, literature, and so on. We also engage with ethics in scholarly disciplines from outside the Islamic tradition, like the interplay of Islamic ethics in fields like bioethics, psychology, arts, business, and now we have sports, and so on. We also engage with the interplay of Islamic ethics with ethics in other religious traditions like Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. So we try to approach the concept of ethics from as much interdisciplinary perspective as possible. As a research center, we have different activities whose nature widely varies throughout the year. So we have two schools directed to students. One winter school usually takes place in January, and one summer school, and this one is one of the editions of this summer school, in which we try to approach the current prospective students or fresh graduates to enlighten them about specific fields and how Islamic ethics can contribute to it, engage with different perspectives from inside and outside the Islamic tradition. We have a number of research seminars, which makes core business of our work. These seminars are preceded by call for papers, and researchers and scholars from around the world apply to these events. And the events always result in a peer-reviewed publication. We have two publication podiums as a research center. We have the Journal of Islamic Ethics, and which is a peer-reviewed journal, and it is now included in Scopus Index databases, so it is a Scopus Index journal. And we have the book series Studies in Islamic Ethics, which is also published by Brill. Both publications are published by Brill, and they are both available in open access. And by the way, publishing in the journal or in the book series is open for everyone. If anyone has a project related to the broad field of Islamic ethics, can always apply. They are all accessible via the Brill website. We also organize an international conference per year, and the international conference is by invitation, not by call for papers. We usually have a topic, and then we invite the key contributors to the publication, the peer-reviewed publication of this theme. We invite them together, discuss a possible theme and publication project, and then we bring the people together, and also we usually have a publication plan coming from the international conference. So we have different activities, academic related activities, sometimes directed to the students, sometimes to the researchers and scholars, and we also have a number of public lectures, usually directed at the average educated public. Besides this, we also have an MA program entitled Applied Islamic Ethics, in which we focus not only on the theoretical, but we also focus on the applied fields. It's a 2-year program. It is part of the College of Islamic Studies. This is the college to which CILE is affiliated, to which our research center is affiliated. And we offer a number of international and national scholarships for international and national students to spend a full program in full MA program in the College of Islamic Studies. We also have a number of agreements with different universities to allow for exchange of students. We have an agreement with the University of Oxford, where students can go and spend time at Oxford while working on their MA thesis. And we also have an exchange program with the University of Leuven. University of Leuven is one of the co-organizers of this event. And we have very good and sustainable partnership with them. And this year we started having the first student coming from the University of Leuven to spend one full semester in our program. This is how the research ecosystem at CILE works. We also, by the way, have programs for visiting professors, professors who can spend one semester, sometimes more, to do research activities and work on publications while being affiliated with CILE. Because of the COVID-19, we had logistic difficulties because of this. So the program, visiting professorship program, was frozen more or less. We hope that this will be active again soon, and that we can start receiving colleagues interested in this, and they can join CILE on a temporary basis to work on specific projects related to Islamic ethics. So this is more or less what we are doing at CILE. Now I move to the part that should have been given by my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Ray Giardini. And again, I use the opportunity to wish him speed recovery, and that he will be able to be with us and resume his activities the soonest possible. Today we have we started the 2-day summer school on sport ethics. This event, we are doing it in collaboration with 2 institutions. Most of our activities, we do them in partnership with our institutions. This time we do it in collaboration with the University of Leuven. As I mentioned, this is a good partner for CILE in general, not only for this event, and also the Walid Innovative Summit for Health, WISH. This is their acronym based here in Doha, and we also have a long-term partnership with them. This summer school is about the interplay of sports and ethics. And again, as I explained, not only within the from within the Islamic tradition, but we try to seriously and critically engage with perspectives from inside and outside the Islamic tradition. At this moment of our human history or the history of mankind, we can hardly imagine that someone has nothing to do with the sports in whatever capacity. We either practice them, watch them, have children who practice them, know friends or fans of a specific sport, athletes, football players, whatever. So the topic is relevant to almost everyone on earth. These are topics which we are really interested in as CILE, as a research center. We are always eager to conduct research on issues that touches the people, and have important social relevance. Of course, this year we have another layer of significance, especially when it comes to Doha and Qatar. Qatar is hosting the World Cup, this year's edition of the World Cup, and it is the first time in the Arab world and in the region. This is the topic of everyone in Qatar, and of course, by extension, worldwide, and all those who are interested in football. As a research center specialized in ethics or Islamic ethics in particular, of course, this was a good opportunity for us to do our contribution and how we can think of the sports that everyone is speaking about at the moment from an ethical perspective and from the perspective of a research center specialized in ethics. We have a galaxy of speakers, I have to say, and from the informal discussions before formally starting today, I have noticed that they know each other. So there is more or less like a natural relationship between the speakers of today because of their interest in the theme of sport ethics. So we are very happy to host them for this program and to be with us today. We will go through, for sure, wide range of interesting topics because this is the nature of the topic itself. Sports is, I don't want to say interfering or intervening in every aspect of our life and in every research area related to ethics. So it's not only about improving our health and our health condition, the traditional approach to ethics, especially in the pre-modern period, and the composition of good character, which necessitates combining between good mental health and good physical health, and here comes in sports. But now, since the 1970s, as you see in the booklet, and later we have philosophy of sports, we have very complex issues, set of issues related to sports. The cross-gender relations, the gender relations between men and women when it comes to sports, how to classify even the gender, who is man and who is woman when it comes to sports. Is it okay to differentiate between them in the competitions, not, etc. Sexual ethics when it comes to these cross-gender relations. We have the contribution of bioethics, and this is my own research area. Bioethics, we have business and sports ethics, we have virtue ethics, discrimination ethics, etc., etc. So hopefully we will go through as many of these issues as possible during these 2 days. I will stop here because we already go behind the schedule a little bit. And we will start the first lecture No, I don't think we are behind the schedule because the first is 11:30. So I'm happy that I didn't take time from the next speaker. So you have the booklet which gives details about the theme of the summer school, about the bios of the speakers, all the details. So I will not get into all these details in order to save time and to give the speakers as much time as possible. So I will just mention the name and the affiliation of the speakers and the theme or the title as it stands in the program of their talk, and then I give them the floor. So in about 5 minutes from now, we will have the first speaker, Dr. Carwyn Jones from Cardiff School of Sport and Health Sciences, Cardiff Metropolitan University in Wales. The topic will be about competition and virtue ethics in sports. Dr. Jones, you are with us, I suppose? No, not yet? Okay. Anyhow, we have about 5 minutes from now on. We will contact Dr. Jones and see if he's available. And the next one is Christian ethics and sport, Dr. Dries Vanisakar. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So you are here with us. Okay, so Dr. Dries, you are okay if Dr. Jones didn't join on time, that you start at 11:30? Will this be okay with you?
No problem with me, no problem.
Okay, so we will see if Dr. Jones joined. Okay, we will follow the schedule. If he didn't, we can switch so that he can teach at or give his talk at 12:30. So we have like about 5 minutes break, and then we start. So Dr. Vanisakar, you can start.
Okay, do you hear me? Is everything okay with the sound?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation by the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics. Today I will speak about Christian ethics and sport. Based on literature, Paul Bickley, The State of Play, Novak, Michael Novak, The Joy of Sports, and Nick Watson and Andrew Parker, Sport and the Christian Religion. But also on two, and especially on two recent Christian declarations on sport. And on one hand, the Protestant one, and on the other hand, a Catholic one by the Vatican. So I will try to give an overview of Christian ethics and sport. First, of course, first of all, we have to determine what we are talking about. So I will start with a short overview of what do we mean with ethics and sport, and what is my view of it. So ethics, we all do know, also called moral philosophy, discipline concerned with what is morally good and bad, right and wrong. It's also applied to any system of theory of moral values or principles. I will not continue on that because I think everyone is concerned with it. Sport, of course, yeah, what do we mean with sport? It has already been said in the introduction. For a long time, sport philosophers and scientists have tried to provide a suitable definition of sport, and apparently this is not an easy task, since no generally accepted definition has been found hitherto. So in addition, it should also be noted that sports are subject to historical change. What we consider to be sport today may not be seen as sport tomorrow, and vice versa. Think, for instance, at the possibility thought by the International Olympic Committee to put competitive video gaming and break dancing as new disciplines on the program of the Summer Olympic Games of Paris of 2024. But talking about sports, maybe we can define it for the moment as such: bodily motions of individual or collective agents who, in accordance with particular rules of the game, affect ludic performances which, on the condition of equal opportunity, are compared to similar performances of oneself or others in a competition. But there's more to be added. Sport is not, of course, only an activity on its own, but it has also an exterior. After all, non-participating outsiders can take notice of sports. They can observe them, evaluate them, be pleased or be annoyed about them, and they can interpret them in many ways. So we can conclude by asserting that, at the one hand, sport is a kind of a world of its own, in that it exhibits the character of a play which, ideally speaking, pursues no external purposes. On the other hand, however, this encapsulated world has also an exterior in what it presents itself to outsiders in the form of a highly expressive story, which, however, does not have a specific content, so that various forms of meaning can be attributed to it. Once again, it is in this multi-interpretability which makes sport so attractive to people from all parts of the world. At the same time, however, this multi-interpretability also makes sports prone to external functionalization and even ideologization. Ideologies can use or misuse also sports. A little bit about the context of sports, because sports never exist without a context. In the first instance, we have to think of institutional embedding of sports. For instance, a group of children making a play, an appointment to meet in the afternoon in the backyard in order to play, say, football or basketball. Already there, the appointment as such, as well as the particular time or space, indicate a kind of initial institution. It also comes to more advanced forms of sports. Training programs have to be applied, competitions to be coordinated, playgrounds to have be supplied and to be kept in good condition. The transportation of athletes and sports equipment has to be organized. Referees have to be engaged. Results have to be documented, and so forth. So there is a real sport system. Of course, this structural dependence of the sport system, we might call it, explains also why the system has to constantly make known the attractiveness of sport to external contributors. So in other words, the sport system has to care for an appearance of sports that motivates potential benefactors to make their contributions to maintain or even boost the system. This, however, entails presenting sport in a way that fits with the various interests of the potential benefactors. And so sport becomes a kind of product which promises to satisfy the interests of various individuals, groups, and institutions. That's why the sport system itself is so readily and easily available to serve the ideological, political, or economic purposes of others, for otherwise it would not be able to generate the resources it needs to survive. I will not go into detail because I think you are all engaged with sports and also different sports to look at it. So I was asked to do something about Christian ethics and sports. First of all, of course, Christian ethics and sports is also contextualized in the broader relation between ethics and sports. Not forgetting the many positive values that can be experienced in and through sports, such as teamwork, altruism, strength, self-control, justice, respect, loyalty, wisdom, self-sacrifice, equality, courage, generosity, joy, honesty, tenacity, and hard work. And think of the cycling that is actually ongoing in the heat in France, in the Tour de France. Solidarity, peace, friendship, love, and community spirit. Sport has been fraught with ethical and moral issues for over a century. Some scholars even say from the very beginning onwards. The authors Watson and Parker, drawing on others, take us through the chart sheet, not of which seemed exaggerated. So besides the secularization of Western culture and the microcosm of sporting locals, the scientification, the scientization, commodification, and professionalization of sports since the 1960s has largely been driven by the allied advent and growth of technology, for instance, also the media and television, and mass sponsorship. And according to some scholars, this shift has been a major determinant in the decline of ethical values in the sporting realm. So recognizing that the applications of science to sport, for instance, biomechanics, physiology, and psychology, is not a negative development in itself, scholars highlight that these historical changes may have inadvertently led to a more utilitarian approach to sport. I cite Tweetmeyer, I quote him, "Science, a necessary although not sufficient good in kinesiology, ends up overwhelming in the field. Consequently, the study of human movement is unalterably crippled." End of quote. Any quest for deeper spiritual meaning, or simply a spirit of freedom and playfulness in sports context, is often then lost in a quest for external gains such as winning of personal glory, status, financial greed. So the moral and ethical issues that have materialized from this instrumental approach to sport are innumerable and have been at least partly driven by what Walsh and another known author, Giulianotti, Ethics, Money and Sport, is Sporting Mammon in 2007, calls, and I quote, "the sporting mammon that rapidly emerged as sport was professionalized and became big business." So key areas of research on this topic include the physical and verbal abuse of opponents, even teammates, fan violence, including sectorialism, intimidation, blatant disregard for the rules and laws of play, and a deliberate dismissal of established behavior codes, and so on and so on. The actual situation is very known. Yeah, there was a European research project in Germany, Belgium, England, Denmark, Austria, and Slovenia called VOICE, Voices for Truth and Dignity, Combating Sexual Violence in European Sport through the voices of those affected. And based on confidential interviews, it showed that sexual violence, defined as with or without body contact and sexual transgressive behavior, in most cases in sport clubs or residential sports schools by a coach, has perpetrated 78% of the cases. So, and the average age of the victim was 15, while the average duration of the abuse was 4 8.7 years. So by recapitulating the fact that elite sports, for instance, football or soccer in the States, cycling, Formula One attracts a lot of money, but that also commodified sport activities have become a strong profit-making economic sector. So what about fairness? What about sports integrity? And so on. But this is, of course, ethics in general. What are the reactions? I go on and on to not to lose many time on the general things. What are the reactions in the field of sport? So within the sport organizations, ethical concerns are dealt with by a better regulation, player education, or even legislation. All the big associations, for instance, the FIFA and the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and the UCI, the Union Cycliste Internationale, so the cycling federation, have their own code of ethics and their own ethics committees. You find it also on their official websites. But of course, there are several practical initiatives within the world of sport, both in the USA and across continental Europe. For instance, the American Sport Education Program, the Center for Ethics, the Character Counts Project, and the Positive Coaching Alliance. But nevertheless, daily evidence tends us to be suspicious of sports. Point of interrogation. At least in the past, it enshrined the disciplines of self-disciple, courage, and self-sacrifice. In simple terms, it was at least useful for moral development. It now seems the hotbed of the worst behavior of human beings, with stories of athletes like Lance Armstrong, the personification of winning at all cost, or with scandals within the so-called new organized religion, with churches as FIFA and the International Olympic Committee. But now I come to my proper subject. What about Christian ethics and sport? So on what basis, other than sport's undeniable popularity, should Christians position themselves to sport? There can be found arguments on several levels. First of all, we should consider the fact that a lot of scholars have concluded that sports bears a striking resemblance to religion and has to be taught upon by theologians and scholars of religious studies. There is a scholarly consensus that in the late modern era, so I'm talking about end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, sport reflects and in some way has come to supplant religious identification and practice. One of the nowadays leading scholars in that field is Robert Ellis, author, among others, in 2014 of The Games People Play, Theology, Religion, and Sport. If we look back into history, the position of Christianity towards sport has changed over time, occupying various points on the spectrum, ranging from outright rejection, for instance, in the early church, where they speak about place and sport just to see the difference with the real Christians, through a hard moralism to unashamed appropriation also, muscular Christianity and the Protestant world, Anglican world, but also we will see in the Catholic world at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, with popes who open up to sport and even to competition sport. So nothing has been rejected always, but also uncritical embrace. For instance, after the Second World War, the popes have used also sports and for instance, especially in Europe, cycling as a tool for apostolate in Europe. And you see, they come from reluctance to embracing sports as also a tool for winning new people for the religion, you could say. Yeah. So secondly, for the Christian theologians, it is the divorce of ethics from metaphysics that presents a serious epistemological error, and which is rooted in the fact that for the first 20 years of the discipline, the bulk of ethical reflection on sport was underpinned by secular analytical philosophy. Schools of thought, such as pragmatism, phenomenology, that appear more compatible with spiritual concepts, have slowly begun to emerge in the discipline of sport, which is a promising sign for theological ethics in the field. Scholars argue that we need to explore the metaphysical roots of the problems in sport rather than seeking piecemeal solutions. It is no accident that the two leading journals in the field, Sport Ethics and Philosophy, and the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport, have published papers and books reviews along a spiritual and/or Christian theme. One of the most interesting authors in the field of Christian ethics and sports was the philosopher and theologian Michael Novak. In his work, The Joy of Sports, End Zones, Bases, Baskets, Balls, and the Consecration of the American Spirit, first edited in 1976 and a re-edition in 1994, he argues that, and I quote him, sports are not the game of life. Sports are not the game of life. Sports are best understood as a religion, but they are not Christianity. Sports inculcate important moral values, but an athlete is not necessarily a moral man or woman in other spheres of life. Sports are lovely for their own sake. We should not be naive about how much of their value is transferable to the rest of life. And this is the end of the quote on page 217 of Michael Novak's The Joy of Sports. If we look at the literature in the field of Christian ethics, it has grown significantly during the last decades. They embrace numerous ethical sporting dilemmas, for instance, competition, winning at all costs, notion of self-control, Protestant work ethic and moral imperatives of Calvinism and Puritanism, emphasizing individual calling and moral perfection, for instance. What about mechanized approach to sports versus play ethic? What about high-risk sports? What about disability sport? And so on. There is a range of topics that could be addressed using the Christian ethics or ethical frameworks that have a theological basic, such as the virtue ethics, of course, of Aristotle, but also of MacIntyre, Paley's utilitarianism, and Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory. Other theological investigations of morality in sport that have concentrated on the sin of pride and the virtue of humility have in part utilized the Catholic model of the 7 deadly sins, wrath, greed, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony, to examine sport experience, drawing specifically on interpretation of this concept from pastoral theology and psychiatry. And along these lines, there is also an emerging body of empirical research in the field. We have recent conferences, for instance, on Christian ethic and sport in 2011 at the University of Cambridge, religion, sport and ethics in 2018 at our Catholic University of Leuven, and 3 international seminars hosted by the Vatican's Church Sport Office in 2005, 2007, 2009, that addressed, among other things, the ethical dimension of sport, provides another promising sign that the discipline of theology and church is beginning to take sport more seriously. And now I come to 2 recent official declarations which underline the Christian ethical positions towards sport today. The first one is from Protestant and Anglican denominations. It is called a Declaration on Sport and the Christian Life. It has been issued in 2013 and it contains 12 points. I will rapidly give an overview. The first point is sport has a legitimate place in the Christian life. So it means that sports has its basis in a divinely given impulse to play and deserves a rightful place in Christian living. People play sport primarily for the love of the game, the thrill of the competition, and the sense of community that comes from participation. When played and watched in faithfulness to God, sport occupies a legitimate place as part of the created world and helps express our relationship to God and to one another. When passion for sport exceeds passion for Christ or the work of his church, or when sports become all-consuming and commitments such as worship, service, and family are diminished, sport poses a challenge to the consecrated life. In light of who God is and who he calls us to be, we must examine and order our affections and priorities regarding sport. The second point, sports touches all dimensions of human life. God created humans as holistic and unified creatures. Sport engages us not only bodily, but also mind and spirit. It can powerfully affect our emotions, mental states, and spiritual lives. Our experiences in sport can, at times, uplift as well as disappoint us. When sport is viewed only as a physical activity, participants miss important transcendent moments that engage one's entire being. The third point is sport can be a means of spiritual formation. So Christians acknowledge the bodily dimension of spirituality and practice faith in and through sport as embodied people. Like aesthetic endeavors, sport can remind us that God is the source of all strength, grace, and beauty of movement. Sport can help focus our attention on the reality of God and our humanness in special ways, offering formative experience in which God communes with us. When sport is approached self-indulgently and apart from the wisdom of God, spiritual growth is thwarted, hindering our formation. The fourth point is sport can glorify God. To glorify God is to reflect the will and way of Christ in everything. Thus, the quality of the Christian's play and participation should be distinctive, marked by spirit-informed virtues, including love, hope, faith, patience, kindness, humility, self-control, and other fruit of God's Spirit. Success in sport competition can help garner public acclaim for oneself, one's team, one's community, or one's country. But these forms of glory should not be confused with bringing glory to God. The fifth point is competition is an essential element of sport. In competition, players test their skills and strategies in an environment of uncertainty and drama. Competition provides opportunities for personal growth, friendship, enjoyment, and can lead to maximum athletic performance. During games, relationships are characterized by playful antagonism, in which competitors elevate their own interests above those of their opponents. This playful antagonism is central to the concept of sport. However, when winning becomes an end in itself, it can breed resentment and may dishonor God. Tactics and environments that persuade players, coaches, and fans to supplant playful antagonism with mean-spiritedness have no place in a Christian approach to sport. The sixth point of this Protestant Anglican document is the true value of sports is inherent in the experience itself. The seventh is sport has many benefits, but they are conditional. And here they explain, when we do sport well, it has the potential to improve health, develop social and familiar relationships, strengthen moral character, foster positive life habits and civic engagement, and it can act as a vehicle for peace, reconciliation, and the witness of the good news of Jesus Christ. But, and they underline this, these effects are conditional. Their realization depends upon the moral and symbolic means we give to sport as well as the motivations of the participants. It should not be assumed, they say, that sport, irrespective of these considerations, will have its intended beneficial effects. The eighth point is God created our bodies for his service and our enjoyment. So sport can promote physical health and well-being and encourage the stewardship of our bodies. At the same time, sport entails a risk of injury and a potential for abuse. Sometimes sport encourages violence as a part of competitive strategy and elevates the probability of injury beyond a reasonable level. An unhealthy pursuit of excellence can encourage the use of questionable training habits and harmful performance-enhancing practices. The human body is a reflection of the image of God, and such practices should not be condoned. And then the ninth point is we do not control whether God favors one player or team over another. You can never have an economic belief that you pray to God to win, and only if you win, you will be happy with your God. And the tenth point is Christian virtues are revealed in behaviors that go beyond obeying the rules. For instance, you can do another thing than following the rules. You can be honest and say to the referee, I have made a mistake, so you have to intervene as such. Sport programs, the 11th point, are a vital component of Christian education. And the 12th and last point is that sport is powerful. Sport inspires us with displays of grit and grace. Competitive drama moves us in ways that few other forms of entertainment do. Watching sport can be a means of celebrating God's creation and goodness, leading to a spirit of hope and joy. And now I come to the second document, and this is a document I had the opportunity to collaborate with, and this is the Catholic point of view from the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life, and has been established in 2018. And it is the text Giving the Best of Yourself, a document about a Christian perspective on sport and the human person. And it has 5 chapters, motives and purpose of giving one's very best. And is also with preface by Pope Francis. And he says that giving one's very best is a fundamental theme in sports, as athletes both individually and collectively strive to achieve their goals in the game. When a person gives his very best, he experiences satisfaction and the joy of accomplishment. And the same is true in human life in general and in living out the Christian faith. We all want to be able to say one day with St. Paul, stresses the Pope Francis, and I quote St. Paul, I have fought to the end the good fight, finished my course, I have kept the faith. So this document, Giving the Best of Yourself, attempts to help the reader understand the relationship between giving our very best in sports and in living the Christian faith in every aspect of our lives. The second chapter is on the sport phenomenon. Chapter 3 is of the significance of sport for the human person. Chapter 4, and I come back to that, is challenges in the light of the gospel. And the 5th chapter is the church as a key protagonist, with some conclusive remarks. But I will come to chapter 4, which stresses ethics in sport. So the document endeavors for a human and just sport. So I quote, I stay close to the text to be more clear. We have already spoken in the document, they say, about the meaning dimensions of sport as well as its place in the search for goodness and truth. Like any other human reality, however, sport can be turned against human dignity and against the rights of people. And the Church therefore raises its voice when it sees human dignity and true happiness threatened. So, and they want to promote human values in sport. There is a criticism on a lot of things, but also a very positive evaluation of sport as a shared responsibility for all good. I see I already have 35 minutes, a monologue. I will conclude so that maybe we can more talk about it and ask questions. But I will conclude with the fact that Pope Francis is very interested. He himself, as for instance also predecessors as John Paul II, but even Benedict XVI, they all were very interested in sport. And that's also why this first official document was made in 2018. And next September, the Vatican will also organize a 2-day about sport for all. The human person will be stressed as the center of an ethical vision on sports. And of course, there is still a long way to go to get a well-balanced relation between sport and ethics, and maybe Christian ethics could deliver a good help for searching and finding this balance. So I will stop here with my monologue. Otherwise, I think it will be too much to follow. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your very interesting presentation and sharing these thought-provoking ideas. And I open the floor for the discussion. Normally speaking, you can submit your question in written in the chat box, and I believe there is also a Q&A box, and you can just raise your hand to virtually, I believe, to ask a question. So I first open the floor. Do we have any questions from the speakers, from the audience? For the speakers, you can just unmute yourself and talk for the colleagues. I personally have my own questions, but I don't want to misuse the power and monopolize the floor by raising my own questions. So if any of the colleagues have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and talk. Give the sign of raising the hand to ask the questions. Just let me check if there is anything that I missed from the questions. No. Okay, so there is sorry. I see hand from Khalid Al Ansari. You can just type your question. I believe, I don't know how can I unmute you. So you can just type your question and I will read it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, it is afternoon, so good afternoon to everyone. Assalamu alaikum all. Thank you for, I just want to actually say a small word of thanks for the Center of Islamic Legislation and Ethics for bringing, you know, like a wealth of experts to this 2-day session. And my question on, you know, like in less than 2 minutes, we have heard about transgenders, sport people, and it is actually raising an ethical and fairness question. From fairness, a transgender sport person who is physically a man, but he has converted himself to a woman, from fairness, you should allow him to actually play against other women. However, from ethical point of view, a man is built in a more muscular form and have more, you know, like physique strength than a woman. This is natural. So if you allow, from ethical point of view, a man to compete against women, although he's a transgender, it is not really ethical. I mean, in my point of view, I see it as non-ethical because you are allowing one person who has natural abilities exceeding the other competitors because he's not really, he was not born as a woman. So where does Christianity teachings look at this issue? I mean, would you allow, if based on your experience, and I enjoyed your writing of 2018, but it does not answer that question. Thank you.
Okay, can I? Yes. So thank you for your question. It's a very pertinent question. And I have to admit that when I was collaborating with the document in 2018, I myself asked also that question to the other specialists or people from the Vatican, and they said we will not mention it in this document because the media and all the people will directly go to this point and forget about all the rest of the text. So they prefer not to talk about it. And of course, they will talk about it. Next September, we have another meeting. And there, the question will be raised again, I think. So, but I think the Vatican will express the Christian Catholic vision that every human being as a person has his or her or its own value. So, but they will not make decisions on that because they leave that for the sport organizations. So, and this is also a hot topic now in every sports association, every international federation, Olympic committees, and so on. So I think the role of the Christian ethics is of course an important role, and the question is very pertinent, but I think they will not elaborate on this, and certainly not they will try to influence the decision on that. So, but more I do not know about it, so I'm not engaged with the real ethical commissions and so on Christian level. My specialization is especially church history and looking at the relationship between Catholicism and sport, but I'm aware of the very pertinent and very important question that could not be avoided in the today and tomorrow. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. Maybe also we will hear more about this from other speakers during the coming talks. There is a hand from Dr. Haifa Jawad, so please feel free. I think you are mute. Mona, maybe you can unmute Dr. Haifa. Okay, now I think we can hear you.
Okay, first I'm sorry about my voice because I'm having a flu. I hope it's not corona anyway. My question is to do with Christian ethics, and particularly with committed Christians. To what extent do committed Christians reconcile a Christian ethics of sport with secular principles that permit physical activities and physical education?
Thank you for your question. If I understood well, the question is, how do you reconcile your Christian ethics with the physical education? Yeah.
Yes.
So I have to say that, of course, in the world there is a huge tendency to physicality, the body, the sporting body as a machine, with exclusion of the more spiritual behavior. And this, I have to say, in Belgium, for instance, at our Catholic university, there is a sports institute that was erected in 1939, 1940, after an encyclical of Pope who said, it was still Pope Pius XI from 29, an encyclical, who said, of course, in that period, this was with fascism and with National Socialism in Germany and the cultus of the body. But the Pope said we should not be afraid of physical education, but we should organize it in our own institutions. So he called for Catholic sports education. And we have still that in Leuven, for instance. We have a very modern sports institute, but of course it's still part of the Catholic University. And they try to have an up-to-date vision of how Christians or Catholics in a secularized world speak and think of sports. And you see that also, for instance, in the evolution of the Catholic theology and also of the Vatican towards sports. They say sports is a world on its own, and we should participate in that secular world. But of course, as a Christian individual, you have the opportunity to be a sporter as a woman or a man with a Christian education as a person. So there are no in the history. The first was to do it apart from other institutions, but now this world is developing faster and faster, and we have also people who do not believe that come to the Catholic University in Leuven. So it is not, you should not be Catholic to study at Leuven. But of course, the institution is still expresses itself still as a Catholic university. So they are open to the world, but the message is, as a Christian, you can participate in the broader field of physical education, but of course, as a real Christian, you will always see that you are a holistic person with a body and a spirit. So I don't know if my answer is what you expect. Thank you.
It's fine. I think I was just trying to see to what extent, because of course in case of Islam is totally different, and there is a problem within the context of Islam vis-a-vis sport activities in modern day, which what we are trying to resolve. In other words, practicing sport and physical education and keeping your identity as a Muslim. And we have a problem with that so far, and I'll mention that in my presentation.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Maybe I can say only that as a historian, for instance, especially for women, Christian women and sport competitions, there had always been also from the Catholic Church a fear, because within Nazism and fascism there was public female sport or activities also with it's the same problem, I think, with Islam, with how should you be vested and how should women behave in public doing sports. And we had always have this problem also, but it disappeared slowly from the 1960s onward, because before that girls and women could do sport, but the church wanted them to do that behind walls and not in public. And it changed only in the 60s.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Amara.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask if there is a sense within the church institution, Catholic or other church institutions, that in a way sport, today's sport is acting as a church itself, as a religious institution. So is there a sense that there is a competition between the Orthodox religion and sports, that now it's presenting itself as a religion that brings happiness, that maybe gather more people than the church itself? You know, when we see the number of viewers that are watching some of the events, we are talking about billions. So, and in a way, the sports, even if it's secular, but it's kind of celebrating this as if maybe it's doing better than religions. So what do you think about this?
Thank you for your very interesting question. Well, as I mentioned, there are people like the good colleague Ellis who say that, of course, sport is as a religion, but yeah, you have to. My opinion is yes, religion in the sense of it is gathering people together. There is a lot of success. They are also giving happiness, you could say, to people. But it is not a real, how do you call that? It's not a religion who is from above with a God. For instance, you could say Ronaldo and Messi, they are the new gods or the new high priests. Yeah, but there is no, for me, there's still a big difference between a religion in the sense of gathering people. It could be also like the music world today. It's the same, it's a parallel. All the people going to festivals here in Europe in the summer, it's also a kind of a religion, gathering people. But a religion like Christianity, like Islam, like the Jewish religion is something more than only gathering people. It's about a God. It's about, so this is not for me the same. So you could say it's a very interesting point of view as a study methodology or a subject, but I think as a believer, you know the difference between sport, and I am also a sport fanaticus. I'm from as a child, but this is not a religion for me. This is my personal view. Yeah.
If I may, I think the contradiction is not on the religious institutions, because they, I think the contradiction is the sports organization and sport institutions, that sometimes they position themselves as secular and they are against any religious expression in sports, but another time then they act as a religious kind of institution, and that's what creates this contradiction. And how then, as believers, how we can engage with this with those sport institutions? Are they secular institutions, or are they kind of institutions that are claiming to bring some kind of a new religion, not in the sense of maybe in an institutional sense, but in the sense of spirituality?
Yeah. No, but I think, personally, I think there is a big difference, and I understand what you ask, and this is also a contradiction. There have been no time that you see in sport on the fields more religious expressions by individual players, for instance, than now in Europe, because this is the changing world. We are so-called in a secularized society, but on the field you see more and more expressions, what you did not see in Europe 20 years ago, with religious expressions. Not only people from Islam, but for instance also from Brazil, Pentecostalism. They also express their beliefs, their religion on the field. So this is a very interesting sociological study object also. So, and then therefore I think that a lot of people compare sport as a new religion, because of course it's an international mass phenomenon that gathers a lot of people around the sport, around as participants, but also, for instance, you could say also all the individual sporting people. If you are 20 years old or 30 years old and you cannot say that you have already run a marathon, you are almost becoming an exception in this world. So everyone is now a top sporter, you could say. And this is maybe also a kind of a new religious gathering, or you have to be a member of that new religion, so-called top sport. But this is still for me another level than a real religion. So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. I have two questions from the audience. One question about how the churches currently are promoting sports and ethics to its members. And the other question is about the Christian ethical position on physical sports like boxing or UFC that primarily cause injury on participants.
Yeah. So the first question, if I remember well, is about how they promote Christian ethics to their members. Well, I have to say, for instance, the two documents I quoted, the first one is from the Anglican and Protestant denominations, and it's especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the States and in Great Britain. So they have, of course, a lot of sport associations. They have a lot of modern, the websites and so on, the mass media. So a lot of people, but of course, you should not forget also the educational system. The Christian sports is very, very extended in the States and in Europe, the Anglo-Saxon world especially, and they are above all Protestant and Anglican. So for this part, they have websites, they have schools. In the States, you know, the sports universities, the colleges are very extended or very well known. So they have always their people talking about ethics. But this is a big problem also with the American system of football and competitive and being a hero already as a student. So they have a big problem with ethics and sports also in the States, and especially in this professional football world. The football, for the American football, so not the soccer. Also for basketball, due to the university system that you can be an excellent student when you are a good sporter, a good athlete. And there, this is also sometimes very competitive, and people do things that are not supposed to be done as a Christian, and this is not ethical, a lot of these people. Another thing I can say for the Catholics, how do the churches talk about it? Well, there is a big difference. In the Vatican, you have a council for culture, and you have also this council for family, for lay people, family and life, and they try to make documents as such, and also interviews. They have websites, and in for instance, in preparing now the Olympics of France in Paris 2024, there is a special bishop, even in high secularized France, a Catholic bishop who will lead a whole program with prayers, with information for Catholic or Christian athletes, and so on. So this is also something you see that is still gaining more and more interest, because sport is very important in society, and also the Catholic Church, and especially our Pope Francis. I already mentioned that in September there is a new conference, a 2-day conference with people from the FIFA, with people from the Olympic Committee, and so on. You see, Pope Francis wants to be there also in that field. So this, I hope, is a little bit the answer to the question. I have to say, for instance, in Belgium here, there's a totally different position. The church is not aware, I have the impression, that it is very important to be there in the sports field. But of course, our church in Belgium has a big problem because it goes faster and faster now, the secularization. And this is a big challenge for people of the church. I try to do my best to write a lot of articles on the history of sport and the Catholic Church, in the hope to have some people that will say, maybe today we should think about it, but in a different way, of course, because the society has changed totally. So the influence of the Catholic Church in Belgium is not at all the influence they had from until the 1960s. So it changed a lot. And the second question about what is the position, for instance, on pugilism, on boxing sports, on other sports that can have a lot of injuries on the head and on the total body. Well, it's very interesting, because in the history of the Catholic Church, they called even boxing a Catholic sport. Why? Especially in the States, because it were immigrants from Italy, above all from Italy, who were the best boxers. And there had been a point of view, ethical point of view, very interesting. In the Second Vatican Council, there is a document on the church in the world, and there sport is also mentioned. But sport is only mentioned because some people thought about the modern society, and we have to see sport as a cultural phenomenon on its own, and we as Catholics can deal with it, and we have to have a viewpoint on that for the Catholics. But there were a lot of conservative, you could say, Italian cardinals who did not want to have the mention of sports in the documents because of boxing. And they say, how can you talk about sport if you allow boxing to be a discipline of sports? So they had a big problem with it, with the fact that giving someone a blow on his head, how can you reconcile this with Christian ethics? But other theologians and people of importance within the Catholic Church, they say boxing you could also see as a noble art of sports if you follow the rules. And the problem with boxing had been, they say, in the history of boxing, that too much people, for money, for reasons of drama, boxing had been deteriorized from its noble art. So this is a little bit the history of boxing and the Catholic Church. I have, for instance, in Belgium, found interesting sources that a Catholic priest has done a lot of apostolate in the boxing world, because they were left as people, non-Catholics, as beasts, you could say, because they were boxers. But you see, there is still a role for a church, if they are Christian or not, to deal with people who do sports that in the first sight is not that noble as it should be. I don't know if my answers are a little bit expecting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. There was a question here, I would say the last one, so that we can wrap up the first lecture, is about, do you feel that Christian religious authority has lost its influence on the moral ethics in sports in Europe? I think you mentioned something briefly about the influence of the Catholic Church up to 1960s and after 1960s.
Yeah.
Would you like to say a brief comment about this?
Yes. Well, I think that's a fact in the history that they lost their influence. But now with Pope Francis and also with John Paul II, I already mentioned, but also Benedict XVI, they try and they that's also why that document has been promoted and edited as the first ever official document. There were texts and by popes on sport, but this is the first official one. And now in September there will be another official one signed by the Pope and so on. So you feel that they want to have some influence, but not anymore as the leading power, but maybe as the more spiritual, spiritual power within a secular world. So as they leave it up to official associations of the rules and on ethics and FIFA, EOC, but they want to be inspiring them. And I think this is a little bit the strategy of Pope Francis. He knows that he cannot put his will and say, I, as the Pope, as the head of the Catholic Church, I want it to be like this. No, he wants in a dialogue, he tries to influence the more, you could say, secular, universal sports federations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Vaniseker. It has been a great start, and I'm very happy that destiny moved us to bring you as the first speaker. It seems that Dr. Jones is not yet with us. Is this not true, Mona? He's not available yet.
Yes, not yet.
Okay, so I think we can better show flexibility with this change, and I friendly ask Dr. Christos Anagnostopoulos, I hope I also pronounced the name correctly, and Dr. Camilla Swart-Aris, if we can start the lectures at 1 instead of 2. So we take now the break, the 15-minute break, and then we start at 1. If Dr. Jones joins, then he will be the last speaker. If he cannot join, then we finish a bit early today, and then we resume our activities tomorrow. Dr. Christos and Dr. Camilla, are you okay with this? Okay, perfect. Then we will have now about maximum 20 minutes, let's say 15 minutes. And then we come back 5 before 1, Doha time, so that you can upload your presentations or whatever you can try starting now in the break will be available. And then we start at 1 o'clock. Is this fine with everyone? Okay, okay. So we take a little break now, and then we start in about 15 minutes from now. Thank you so much. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back, colleagues, researchers, scholars, and students, participants, attendants. This is the second session for the CILE Summer School on Ethics in Sports. This session discusses two very important themes in ethics of sports, especially in our modern time. The first one will address business ethics and sponsorship in sports by Dr. Christos Anagnostopoulos. from our university, Hamad bin Khalifa University, Sport and Entertainment Management. And the second talk will be by Dr. Camilla Swart, also from our Hamad bin Khalifa University, Sport and Entertainment Management. It will be on race and discrimination in sport. Each speaker will have 1 hour for the talk and for the Q&A session afterwards. So I start by giving the floor to Dr. Christos.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever this gathering finds you. Can I just start by saying a big thanks to the organizers and for the kind invitation to bring me here today. It is quite special for me because it is my very first engagement with HBKU generally, and it was a big honor for me to be present today and talk about business ethics and connect it with sponsorship within the sporting setting. So again, a big thanks for the invitation. A few words about me. I've just last month joined the university as an assistant professor in sport management, where I will be teaching, or I'm teaching generally, how sport organizations are organized and function, or how should be organized and should be functioning. More with a touch on this kind of responsibly way of behaving themselves, or ethically approaching the mechanisms therein. And I'm also touching on how sport can be used as a vehicle for positive social change and innovation through social entrepreneurship. But if you like, the most important element of my teaching and research is in and around governance, social responsibility, corporate social responsibility for that matter. And if you like, this within the wider sphere of business ethics. Where my also research activity sits in and around these topics, and good colleagues who are actually in this room, in this e-room today, have contributed to those texts, as you can that you see on the screen, and I'm grateful to those contributions. Dr. Mahfoud, Dr. Camilla from our university and from the Qatar University. I'm also consulting various national sport federations on business ethics, on social responsibility, on good governance in Poland, in Cyprus, where I've been up until recently, where I have been the one who actually developed the first ever code for good governance, a little booklet that in a way suggests, if not determines, how national sport federations should be behaving in the wider Cypriot community, sporting ecosystem. And as a result of all these activities, a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, in my former university, the British University, University of Central Lancashire, which has a campus in Cyprus, we put together an application to UNESCO, and we were lucky enough a couple of months ago, just literally a month ago before I joined HBKU, to be awarded the first ever UNESCO chair on governance and social responsibility in sport, that for which happens to be the director and serving as one of the two co-chairs. And Dr. Camila made the honor to join the scientific steering committee. And we consider this UNESCO chair a chair that happens to reside in Cyprus in that particular university, but we approach the whole matter in a more global sphere, if you like, and we have colleagues from around the globe, from all the way from New Zealand and Australia to South America and North America, joining this UNESCO chair. And through this, if you like, really powerful brand, what we're trying to do is to promote ethics, promote good governance, promote social responsibility in and through sport. I would be more than happy to liaise with any of you feel that who would like to contribute to this UNESCO moving forward. Early days, we're still developing the website and all the necessary, if you like, means to further communicate this quite of achievement. But you will be hearing from me on that front in the next few months for sure. So this is, I mean, who's sitting in front of you this afternoon, this evening. A little bit of structure and the content of my contribution to this summer school. I will try to set the scene first and offering some context where I'm sitting, where I come from when it comes to business ethics. Then I will try to somehow deconstruct and define business ethics and corporate social responsibility. And having done that, then I will try to connect it with sponsorship, with sports sponsorship and some controversial discussions in and around sports sponsorship. Let me underline, if you like, that my sponsorship is not my cup of tea. Is not where I'm doing research on, or I'm not teaching sponsorship. I don't see myself. I'm not an expert on sponsorship, but my PhD has been on business ethics and corporate social responsibility within the football setting, if you like. So when I was invited to give this talk, to contribute to this summer school about the topic on sponsorship, sports sponsorship, and ethics and business ethics, I felt that I could position sponsorship within business ethics, within corporate social responsibility, and tell I feel a story that cause a little bit of debate later on, hopefully. So, and I will do that by drawing on, broadly speaking, institutional theory and the concept of legitimacy theory, the legitimacy gap. And I will show you a couple of pieces of research of my own, and together with colleagues from different institutions, where we looked at the corporate social responsibility through sport, that is, companies that are using sport as a vehicle to, if you like, show a more positive face in society. And I will finish off this contribution by perhaps suggesting that the way forward when it comes to sports sponsorship is the idea of a clean sports sponsorship portfolio. And then hopefully that will offer the platform to discuss all these ideas during the Q&A session. I don't know how long it's going to take, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 35, 40, we'll see how it goes. But I will, in any case, I will make sure that we have enough time for some discussion at the end. Let me start by saying, by putting everything into context, and perhaps to give you an idea of where I'm standing when it comes to business ethics. There have been ethical problems all along. Well, of course, right? There have been ethical problems within the businesses all along. The difference nowadays, and if you can easily juxtapose this to the sport context, to the sport sponsorship context, if you like. The difference today is that we as consumers, we as a sport enthusiasts, we expect much more from the businesses who are dealing with sport or not dealing with sport at all. So there have been ethical problems, but it seems, actually it is, the problem is bigger because the expectations of me and you are much higher from the companies that are doing business, from those companies that are liaising with sport more specifically. So this is where this is my starting point. So ethical problems, there have been ethical problems for ages. Ethical problems exist today, but the ethical problems of today's corporate world look much bigger because we expect much more from those companies. So what is business ethics? It is possibly, I will be repeating myself today, or maybe from the very first contribution, or maybe it is very, very likely that participants in the summer school will be listening all this during this two-day event. But I think it is important for us to have a clear deconstruction of those concepts before we move forward. And I feel that it is necessary for us to understand how sports sponsorship and all these legitimacy gaps can be dealt with by companies by deconstructing these concepts. So a study of business situations, activities undertaken, and decisions where issues of right and wrong are addressed, or could be the right and wrong kind of behavior of corporation, of businesses, not in a financial or strategic sense, but more in a more moral sense. It is about what is good. It is about what is bad in doing business in terms of morality. Morality in this instance refers to codes of conduct, codes of behavior put forward by society and distinguish what is right and what is wrong. Morality is therefore the behavior that the society deems to be ethical, deems to be right. While different type of societies, different societies across the globe. So let's read these kind of definitions or of approaches with an effort to further contextualize these little bullet points here. So the goals and activities, because we have to start putting all these concepts within the business world, within this organizational, if you like, setting. The goals and activities, therefore, of the organization should be ethical, that is to conduct business in an honest fashion, to treat the various types of stakeholders in a fair way, being socially responsible, and we will be discussing about this corporate social responsibility, which is, if you like, the notion, the vehicle for the organizations to start doing or to keep doing just that, fair treatment of stakeholders, honest, etc., etc. looking after the environment. And of course, there are different understandings of business ethics, and perhaps I'm the least qualified person within this summer school to explain in detail, if you like, all these different different understandings. But business ethics can be approached from an ethical absolutism perspective, which is as already mentioned, it is the understanding of what is right and wrong, but something that applies to all societies, right? So religious maintain similar moral views: don't steal, don't cheat. You know, this is a kind of more universal right and wrong approach, this ethical absolutism. But business ethics, the ethics of the business, the ethics of the organizations, right, can be also understood by the so-called utilitarianism perspective, the cost-benefit element. So here, the outcome of the action determines if that action is actually moral, right? A moral right action is one that maximizes benefits, good, and minimizes costs. In other words, it recognizes that there will be some bad things happening by the decisions and actions taken by those people within the organizations. But this utilitarianism kind of perspective assumes that, you know, within those bad things, much more good things are happening. So we cannot have it all. So discovery of a medicine to cure cancer, for instance, but with side effects, right? So there are bad things associated with the side effects, but if we can cure cancer, you know, much more people, that is society at larger scale, will be benefited from this kind of medicine. Selling is ethical if benefits outweigh the cost. Sometimes, you know, cost bad needs to occur for securing benefit maximization. These are the principles behind this utilitarianism perspective. That is another way for us to understand business ethics. But of course, it is the ethical relativism or social ethics. Ethics vary between societies. Ethics are socially constructed. In some societies, bribery is accepted, in others, not really. So in some societies, the way people make decisions about certain things is acceptable. In other societies, is less so. So this ethical relativism is a perspective that offers room for some contextual elements to be taken into account when trying to understand why businesses, why organizations and the personnel therein behave the way they do. And the so-called tactical ethics. And I would like us all to keep this in mind for, you know, the purposes of today's contribution of mine. And this tactical kind of ethics perspective in understanding business ethics is when people become ethical, not because they feel so, but for tactical purposes. That is, business offers safe products to avoid bad reputation. It gives to charities to build good reputation and things like that. I won't be suggesting that all nice little things that companies are doing using the power of sport to motivate, to engage, to inspire, especially young kids, is happening for this purpose. It's a kind of tactical, ethical approach. But this is at least the basis of today's contributions of mine. All right, so let's keep this tactical ethics in mind when we move forward for, you know, when we start talking about sports sponsorship and all these things. All right. Generally, as a kind of statement, we should not consider, and I, as Christos, I do not consider ethics as a kind of add-on thing, as an optional thing, right? It is not a soft issue either. So all business strategies, all operations have an ethical dimension. and we cannot escape from that ethical dimension. It's like trying to escape from our own shadow. So this is not really the case. So ethics holds enormous risks for companies, for bad reputation and associated matters, but more importantly, create reputational and competitive opportunities. And there is always the positive side on, presenting less good things, if you like. And I would like to approach most of the times, these positive things and put the positive things first. And then, of course, not disregard the less good ones. So this is generally on ethics, within which, as I mentioned, at least the last couple of decades, or 25, 30 years old now, scholars are coming up with different notions. Now it is the so-called SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the governance and environment and society. But nevertheless, all these acronyms that appear now and then are not very dissimilar to the corporate social responsibility thing that has been around, as I mentioned, for a good 30 years or maybe half a century. So the corporate social responsibility, as I see it, is sitting within or under the wider business ethics area, and is a kind of the business the business element, the business related notion of those people who make decisions in organizations to demonstrate that are socially responsible and are ethically fine and accepted by the wider society. Now, kind of definition is when businesses have responsibilities that go beyond making just money, and entail activities, voluntary activities, and actions that affect people, that affect communities, that affect, positively always the natural environment. It is a commitment of those companies to conduct those activities, to take these kind of actions, so to benefit the society as a whole. So this is what corporate social responsibility is, and this is what organizations are trying to do to demonstrate their ethical face, if you like, their socially responsible face. Some examples: offering equal opportunities to employees, equal pay, equal chances to get promoted within the businesses, improving the quality of life of those employees, for instance, providing housing, or being an environmental friendly company, engaging in recycling or not waste management, or not using elements that are not very environmental friendly, and so on. Contributing to community in which they reside by funding, for instance, the development of a school, offering therefore a little bit more sustainability and creating the next generation of potential employees of that company. So when they donate to foundations, to charitable foundations, for instance, to cure diseases like cancer, like COVID-19, and we have seen a lot of companies contributing the last 2-3 years when COVID-19 became a kind of pandemic. We've seen blue chip companies donating a lot of money for those purposes, or avoiding corrupt practices such as giving or taking bribes. But as we mentioned, this relative ethical perspective in some societies, this very last point is not that unacceptable. And of course, paying obligations, bills on time. These are elements that within the CSR, as we call it, notion demonstrate that companies are behaving in an ethical and socially responsible fashion. With this little background on business ethics, on CSR, what it is, I would like now to move to sponsorship and clarify the term, because I take that not necessarily all of us here are familiar with these business functions, if you like. I understand that if there is, or I assume that if there is a familiarity amongst those of us who are taking part in this school, is more on the ethics, part. I hope that a common denominator is sport, but not necessarily all of us are pretty familiar with several business functions, and one of which is sponsorship. So let me clarify the term, the function, so you can see how this then is connected with sport, the business ethics, the CSR through sport. So it is an activity, whether it is in cash or in kind, in return of for access to the exploitable commercial potential associated with that activity. So there are some there are some dynamics, as you can see here, and you have the sponsor, the company. Let's delimit our discussion to a company, an organization, could be an individual, but a sponsor, right? And you have the sponsee, the other company, right, that enjoys, whatever in cash or in kind the sponsor gives. So there is a shared space there, but also there is another shared space from the second question: what do I want to get, right? So the sponsor gives something, but the sponsor expects from this something that it gives to the sponsee, right, to get something back. So there are some dynamics between sponsor and sponsee, and hopefully, not necessarily in a very explicit fashion, we will discuss in a while. So this is the sponsorship. It's a kind of a give and take exercise between a sponsor and a sponsee. Now, why companies, why organizations become sponsors? Well, for several reasons. Some of them is to increase brand awareness. Not all consumers or potential consumers are aware of that product or service that a company offers. So what the companies want to do through sponsorships is to make their services and products aware to or known to those potential markets. If you have managed to do that, what you also want to do is that people who are aware of your product and service like your product or service. So another reason why companies become sponsors is because they want to make these markets that are aware of their products and services to like them, right? The so-called brand liking. Another reason is one reason is to be aware of a product and service. Another reason is to like it, but quite another matter is to be able or to be willing to buy, to purchase that, right? So we might like things, but we might not have, we might have zero intentions of going and buying them or purchasing them, right? Or using them, right? So another reason why companies become sponsors is because they want to increase purchase intention. If you buy something because you have been convinced, thankfully, right, by a sound sponsorship program, then what these companies want is to keep buying that product, keep purchasing that service. So they want loyalty. But also, and I think this is the focus, this is the crux of my message today, they want to improve their corporate image. Not solely, but also. So which companies often want to improve their image? All of them, but there are certain companies that they feel they need to do that a little bit more. So these are companies that are involved in activities that admittedly, right, are likely to threaten societal welfare. And there are a lot of those companies out there, unfortunately. So alcohol and tobacco production, I think we can all agree in this country, of course, this might not be big of an issue, if you like, but we can all agree alcohol and tobacco production are products that generally threaten societal welfare. So there are companies associated with gambling activities. There are companies that offer, generally speaking, unhealthy food and beverage, right? Or distribute those kind of food and beverages, the so-called fast foods. And there are also companies that produce and supply energy derived from non-renewable sources. If you may recall, this environmental aspect, the environmental friendliness kind of element within the wider corporate social responsibility that sits within the business ethics is one thing. So there are companies also that actually their core business is just that. So these, generally speaking, can be seen, can be perceived as a kind of threat to societal welfare. So what do we know in and around these products, about these products? This is not me talking, it is research has shown all this. So there are foods, there are drinks, which are not good choices for athletes due to their lack of nutrition and high level of salt, sugar, saturated fats. So we know that. It's not these products, these foods are not, they're not good for athletes. They are bad, right? Children, a major market for advertising, as they influence their parents, a lot of us here, to spend, right? Have their own independent spending habits and have the potential to become brand loyal and lifelong customers, the kids. And sponsorship of development programs offer those companies another avenue to expose children to their brands and foster this connection between children and their brand. What we also know, if we look at studies in Australia, in Australia, for example, that 12-year-olds, to cut long story, so this little bullet point here is that children do remember brands, do remember, and also they are expressing their willingness to connect with these brands. So these companies do very, very well what they do and why they do what they do. There are some brands in those pictures that perhaps fall within what we call products or services that potentially can threaten the societal welfare. And these are brands that are taking the central stage of major sporting events. half of the Premier League 20 clubs have gambling sponsors. 17 out of 24 in the second division in England, the Championship, have sponsors, in the main sponsor on their shirts that come from a gambling company. If you look at La Liga in Spain, 35% of the shirt sponsors are active in the gambling, betting, and gaming industry. These are products, these are services that especially young kids do remember well, and they are willing to associate themselves with. In fact, convince their parents to go for them. So what is happening here? These companies, because they are perceived by the society that they offer products and services that are not good necessarily for the society, they have created what we call the social contract has been broken. So they operate the way they operate, and they produce what they produce, and we, right, as a society, we have certain expectations of those companies, right? And it seems that there's a big, depending on the case, there is gap between what society expects and what these companies do. And this is a problem. This is a problem, and this is in the literature, in the institutional organizational institutional theory. It is called the so-called legitimacy gap. What happens if you are against, in front, a legitimacy gap? You try to modify completely the way you do things. Well, that's not that easy if you are that company and you offer that product, right? Second strategy is to determine, you as a company, what is actually legitimate, what is actually ethical. Companies pay a lot of money to do just that, but this is super expensive, and it is also very, very difficult to convince the society that actually what you do is aligned with, should be seen or should be perceived, aligned to your expectations. So the gap is not that big, it's close, it's much smaller. Difficult, expensive. Less difficult, less expensive is those companies to associate with symbols, with values, with institutions that have a strong perceived image of social legitimacy. Guess what? Sport enjoys strong image of social legitimacy. And they say, wow. I mean, it's not a magic elixir, right? There are a lot of problems in sport, but generally speaking, our starting point most of the times is that sport is good. And then we identify and we number a whole, a great deal of things that are not that good. But generally, right, we agree that sport is good. Sport is a kind of symbolizes a lot of, brings a lot of positive values, blah, blah, blah. So these companies, because they cannot change the way they operate, they cannot change the way we perceive them, they go for association with those symbols, sport, in order to be seen as more ethical bodies, more ethical, more socially responsible kind of entities. There are a lot of reasons. I think I'm running out of time, and I would like us to have some more time to discuss. So there are a lot of reasons that have, the literature has identified why CSR, right, is almost a perfect fit, right? With sport, communication power, youth appeal, positive health impact, social interaction, cultural understanding, the awareness and the so-called immediate gratification. All these are elements that, bring this CSR and sport really together, right? And make CSR as a perfect platform for those companies to close as much as they can the legitimacy gap that they are experiencing, and they're using CSR for these reasons. And the last part of my contribution will be focusing on that. Of course, a lot of sport organizations are employing the so-called corporate social responsibility to demonstrate their ethical phase, their socially responsible phase, but it is mainly those companies outside sport that employ CSR for the reasons we just mentioned, the symbols, the values associated with sport, to reduce that gap. Is this the case? So I was curious back in 2015 when I was at Coventry Business School in England, and we examined by drawing on the London Stock Exchange. We examined a 10-year period, and we were looking at the documents of those listed companies in London Stock Exchange, and we were asking the question: do companies outside sport employ CSR for their kind of legitimacy, reducing legitimacy gaps purposes, etc.? And we identified three main themes that they engage their personnel to do all these sport-related activities. They do a lot of philanthropy, but sponsorships was the theme that was the most popular one. Now, we had a little problem methodologically in that piece of research, however, because it was during a time where CSR reporting was becoming really, really popular. So, of course, if you report more over the years, the cases of some of those cases having sport at their core were going up as well. So the final outcome of that paper was that the companies outside sport embrace more and more sport to deliver their sponsorship, social-oriented sponsorship programs. But because of that little problem, the methodological trend, if you like, we repeated that study a few years ago, and we looked at different countries, and we looked at different stock exchanges. We looked at Poland, the Warsaw Stock Exchange in Poland, and then we looked at Moscow Exchange, and we found that actually, indeed, the corporate world embraces sport a lot. Sponsorships, especially for the Polish Stock Exchange, was the #1 theme when it comes to CSR through sport. And if you like a comparison between the 2003 until 2012 study and from 2013 until 2017, you can see how many more cases were identified. Those are the cases that the very same companies report in their official documents and have sport at their core. Okay, and you can see the difference, how much more the companies outside sport embrace CSR through sport. And some little details here. These pics are associated with major sporting events. Euro 2016, for instance, was taking place in France. And as you can see, 2014 and 2015, there is a an increase of those cases. And over here, that was the event. 2016, 2017 goes up again. A lot of companies are associated with those events, and they tend to embrace sport for their sponsorships. If you like, to associate themselves with sport in order to close as much as I can the legitimacy gap. I'm not going, there's no time for me to take you into detail, but we look at the industries as well. You know, and there was an interesting finding that a lot of those controversial industries were employing sport for their CSR activities. So, some takeaway messages. Corporate world has acknowledged the use of CSR through sport. Second, sponsorships have shown little signs of slowing down. Third, and this is a kind of, confirming previous research, particularly prior sporting events, and a little bit after the sporting events have finished, companies employ sport for their sponsorships. So, what to expect to see, what we should be looking for when it comes to sponsorships, when it comes to CSR, when it comes to business ethics, when it comes to companies employing sport to legitimize themselves, to be seen, be perceived as ethical companies, as socially responsible companies. We should be expecting to see a lot of companies. In fact, we can start looking at the sponsorship portfolios of those events associated with various companies and see that a lot of those companies might be, not all of them, but quite a lot of them might be falling within the so-called controversial companies that are using sport as a vehicle to legitimize their own operations, their own activities, their own services, their own products. So let's look at that, and let's wait to see how all this unfolds. But the idea here is, and this is perhaps my last kind of message, is that a clean sports sponsorship portfolio is a challenging exercise. Is easier to say than to do. But if we talk about business ethics, if we talk about ethical behavior, if we talk about social responsibility, then those people who are behind those events, it will be much more ethical, much more socially responsible to embrace a cleaner sponsorship portfolio and move forward that way. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christos. Very, very important information. And I especially admire your neutrality in such a sensitive topic and basing your arguments on research and research results, because I understand general audience, people like us, how sensitive they can be for such issues. So thank you so much. I open the floor for discussions. We have something like a bit more than 10 minutes for the discussions. Again, I have my own questions, but I would like to give the floor to the colleagues and the audience, the attendants, if they have any questions first. So just raise the virtual hand or unmute yourself and talk if you have questions, or send the question through the chat box.
Thank you. Can I start?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christos. Just wanting to hear your views on this topic. In the efforts for cleaner sponsorship portfolios, I mean, tobacco sponsorship has been out of the picture for a very, very long time. And what do you think is some of the main reasons why alcohol sponsorship is still very rife in sport? And then a related question to that, when we've seen the recent announcement that there will be no alcohol served in the stadiums during World Cup, sort of what kind of implications do you think that may have, if any, in terms of alcohol sponsorship going forward?
Well, excellent question. Thank you, Camilla. There is the perspective of the alcohol companies, and I think we have some possible answers why they keep wanting to associate themselves with major sporting events. One thing is, to close that gap, because they are perceived as offering an unhealthy product, a controversial product to the society, but also because, as we said, they want to create the new generation of consumers. So there are obvious kind of reasons why alcohol companies still try and achieve to associate themselves with sport and with major sporting events. Now, on the other hand, the local organizing committees, and perhaps not necessarily only the local organizing committees, have their own responsibility. And they have to make decisions of with whom to associate moving forward for these, for major sporting events. And these are difficult decisions within those rooms to make, because the offers, I suspect, I haven't been in that room in my life. Perhaps I'm not sure I want to be in a room like this, where you have an offer in front of you to that can help achieve a lot of those operational objectives to run your event, and it's quite a huge offer, and you disregard this offer because it comes from a company that falls within the controversial industry list of yours. So I don't know how easy or how difficult it is, but what I know is that the decision makers in that room, with one way or another, make a statement by embracing these companies or not. So my view is that you can always get good offers from a cleaner set of potential sponsors. And if the industry gets that message across, then and demonstrates that that's it, we had enough. There is no junk food anymore associated with this event. There is no alcohol. There is no gambling. There is no whatever. Then that will open the room for cleaner companies to start associating. They cannot compete this because they know that these controversial companies, they know that they have to put on their budget much more money than other companies. So it is difficult to compete if you don't belong to that category. So, but for sure, the decision makers have a responsibility. Now, when it comes to this event, prohibiting alcohol from consumption within the grounds, within the football stadium, well, I see no problem with that. Actually, I think this is the right, outside the cultural context, outside that, I see that there is no reason for alcohol consumption within sporting arenas. There's no reason. So this is me, though. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there are two ways. There is the company's way, there is the organizer's way, and there is the consumer's way, and there is the scholar's way. What we believe it is the right thing others do, but who are we?
Thank you. I have myself a question. You spoke about the okay. So do we have Dr. Amara? Yes, please, Dr. Amara.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Ahmed.
No. You have the priority, please.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Thank you, Christos, for your excellent presentation. My question is maybe for this on the alcohol, the banning of alcohol in the stadium. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Yeah, for the banning of the alcohol in the stadiums, this is not the first time that is being applied. So it was applied in other World Cups, for example, in Russia, 2018. So it's nothing to do with culture, it's something to do maybe with the safety and maybe tackling any abuses, inside the stadium that may lead to some, so maybe the best ways to tackle this is less from a cultural point of view, but maybe from of the speakers.
Absolutely.
My question is sorry about. My question is about sometimes about the CSR and sponsorship. Some companies they give they come into sports with maybe using the kind of the narrative that is not a sponsorship, is a CSR. But when you look behind the curtain, then you feel like this is another way to market themselves maybe differently. I mean, the example of McDonald's, yeah, it's a big sponsor, of international sports organizations, big sports events, but they also have, for example, with they use the narrative of CSR. So here, how can we distinguish between the CSR and the sponsorship?
I don't know if others had a few problems with the sound, but Mahmoud, I think I heard what you asked. Well, it's not that easy to distinguish, and consumers. I think consumers, and that was the ethical problem. That was my thesis, if you like, my very first positioning, is that consumers nowadays are much more aware of what is going on and what is happening out there, and the reasoning behind of what is happening. So we are a little bit more aware of those notions, the marketing stuff, the CSR stuff, all these messages that go along, that exist surrounding those sporting events. So there is a little bit more educated, if you like, consumerism on these fronts. But it's at the same time, sometimes companies are using pure sponsorships to employing sponsorship programs within the CSR kind of framework, just to achieve some of those objectives, the reasons why we mentioned during my contribution of why they do that. But there are no clear-cut boundaries between those products, programs a lot of those times. But this is again me. A lot of companies approaching CSR that way, what can you do with the money you earn? This is most of the companies' approach to CSR. So you earn money, and then what can you do with this money that you earn? How you earn that money doesn't matter. You might have earned that money by employing in all these unethical ways of doing that, right? The question then becomes, now you got the money, what can you do about that? Can you be seen? Can you be perceived as a good boy and girl? Go out there. Why not using sport and sporting events for that matter to demonstrate just that? So this is one approach. What can you do with the money you earn? But I feel that a much more preferable, ideal way to approach CSR is by asking this question: how do you earn your money? And if you ask the question that way, that implies that the processes, procedures, undertakings, exercise associated with how you do business are closer to ethical approaches, closer to socially responsible approaches. So you don't wait to have money to demonstrate how responsible you are. You don't wait to have more customers to demonstrate how ethical you are, how much you embrace the community, how you care about your employees, because this is part of your DNA. This is how you operate ethically and responsibly. All right. So there are two different perspectives, and a lot of those companies to get closer to an answer to your question, Mahmoud, are using the very first approach. They get money and then they try to associate themselves. So if they do that way, it is difficult to differentiate. It is difficult. The other one is much more.
Maybe Christos, the other dilemma is that there is a big gap between elite sports and some sports that are receiving most of the money from sponsors and community sports and grassroots sports. And sometimes those at the grassroots or community sport, they don't have a choice. Even if they know that they are receiving some money from a McDonald's and Coca-Cola in the name of CSR, and this may have a negative impact on the kids, on the children that are going to be future consumers of those products, but they don't have other alternatives. Even the state is disengaging from financing, for example, community sports.
Absolutely. These are even much harder calls from those decision makers in that room to accept or otherwise these kind of offers. So, but as I said, we all have our responsibility how to serve sport as a whole. So it is down to us to decide whether we go for a cleaner or as much clean as possible portfolio, either as a community level or the top, the elite level. But these are the reason why we are talking about sports sponsorship within an ethics, focused kind of summer school is just that. It's so difficult sometimes to make these calls, and the starting points differ from decision makers to decision makers, and that makes the whole exercise an ongoing challenge. So we'll see how we move forward. Thank you, Mahmoud.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With this, we submit our due thanks to Dr. Christos for the insights he has shared with us. And I move to the next talk by Dr. Camila Swart Aris about the race and discrimination in sports. Dr. Camila, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You can see my presentation?
Yes, you can make it in the presentation mode. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you for the Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics for inviting us here, and for Ray in particular. And my thoughts are with him, and that he makes a speedy recovery. Yes, my talk today is on race and discrimination in sport. So I am also going to talk a little bit about myself, but more in terms of my context of being South African and having lived through apartheid and played sport during apartheid, and my experiences in terms of racial discrimination, which really sets my context of my work within sport globally. And then I will move the discussion to sort of more recent incidences around Black Lives Matter, and then take us back more closely to the World Cup and discuss certain issues about the potential of events like the World Cup, or celebrities such as the Mo Salah case that I will present, that possibly could contribute to reducing cases of Islamophobia in particular, and then some concluding remarks. As we've been discussing, you know, although sport is generally seen as a place where we're not bothered with the normal problems of society and where the real world exists, we know that sport is actually a microcosm of society, and for many it is presented as a model of how society should be, but this idyllic representation of sport in the world is rather misleading. And increasingly today, we've seen how racism has reared its head in sport, and then and how we could possibly look at reducing some of these challenges we face in sport by considering the ethical perspective. So as I mentioned, I am South African. I grew up in South Africa, and today is actually a very important day in our history. So it was actually quite opportune for me to be speaking about sport in South Africa, race and discrimination. For many of you who may not know what the 18th of July means for us as South Africans, but it's actually been termed Mandela Day. And I see the UN actually recognizes it as National Nelson Mandela International Day. So Mandela was born on the 18th of July. So in South Africa, it's a time to give of yourself on this day. So it's quite opportune that I'm sharing this this presentation on sport and apartheid and racial discrimination on the 18th of July. So this is typical of what I grew up during the 70s and the 80s, of what it was like to go to school when school was not closed down because of the boycotts in South Africa. And I distinctly remember this day in 1985, where we decided that enough was enough. We want to go back to school. You know, we have to get an education. And as we attempted to go back to school, we were confronted with police and tear gas. And I tell this story because this was my reality in terms of growing up. But despite this reality of racial discrimination in terms of where we lived, what schools you could go to, what beaches you could go to. So whether sport was competitive or recreational, apartheid affected our lives from beginning to end. But despite that, I grew up in a family that had a love for sport, but at the same time also recognized the challenges we were facing as South Africans. I came from a family where my father was a deputy principal at a high school, and it was a school that was very much a part of the struggle and caught up in what was happening. So some of those pictures on the earlier slide was actually taken at the school where my father was teaching. And so, and at that time, in the mid 80s, both my eldest brother was also a teacher at the time at the same school. And so, and during that time, during South Africa's history, we had something called a detention without trial. So you could spend sort of 2 weeks and it could roll over into another 2 weeks and another 2 weeks, but your case would never come to trial. And that's how my brother, my eldest brother and my father spent effectively a year in prison. But at the same time, as I mentioned, while this was all going on, we were also very actively involved in sport. But sport was also seen as a vehicle for change, a vehicle to fight freedom. So we played sport under the banner of SACOS, which was the South African Council of Sport at the time, where we acknowledged that there could be no normal sport in an abnormal society. So we can't play together on the playing field and then go off into our segregated lives. And sport was used as a weapon to fight apartheid. So this is the sort of the context which I grew up playing sport. It was a very important part of our lives, but it was also as a vehicle to dismantle apartheid. And so, of course, growing up, we could never reach the highest echelons of playing sport for our country because South Africa was banned from international sport at the time. So even in today's conversations of, of Russian athletes being banned for sport, I experienced that growing up in terms of not being able to play for my country. But in my case, we did think in that international sanctions was a good thing to do, even though we were being marginalized as well by not being played. But we saw the sort of the bigger picture of the importance and the significance of the sanctions. So this was a sort of a typical, so if you're familiar with sort of historical racial classifications in South Africa, so we were discriminated against based on race, and then you had different historical racial classifications with white being privileged, and then you had African being the least privileged, and then you had colored, which was mixed race, and that's kind of the historical classification I grew up under, and then you had Indian of Indian descent, which was a little bit more privileged than colored. So these historical racial classifications permeated South African society. So this is what a typical sort of colored high school would look like. At the time, you had no school hall. My two main sports were swimming and volleyball. There was no swimming pool at your school. You went to the public swimming pool in another suburb to be able to swim, and you played on the tarmac. Whereas a white school would have all the facilities and amenities, and a black school would have even slightly less than what we had. But despite all of this, I did end up, and you'll be able to see the difference. And I've included this picture so that you get a sense of how race determined what access you had to education, to sport. So this was the university that I ended up going to, which was predominantly in terms of historical racial classification terms at the time, was a white university. But by the time I got to university, you know, some of those laws were changing where they allowed people of other races to start attending these institutions. But really, just to give you the stark difference between in terms of facilities. And here you can see much younger Nelson Mandela on the picture, and the gentleman next to Mandela with the specs is actually my father, because the school was a place of struggle. And when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, he actually visited the school in terms of acknowledging the role the school played in terms of fighting apartheid. So I set this context to give my talk, in that I've lived this racial discrimination. So I often tell people that, you know, when these incidents happen, like you know, all the racial abuse that players are experiencing, or the Black Lives Matter, or when I've investigated cricket, which was quite a popular sport in South Africa recently, in the light of Black Lives Matter, I have to see it from my context in terms of where I've come from. So when we talk about racial discrimination, essentially it's the transformation of race prejudice through the exercise of power against a racial group defined as inferior by individuals and institutions with intentional or unintentional support of the entire culture. So when this translates into sports, what we see is this, while there may not be as many overt acts of racism, although it still exists, it is this unconscious racism that has become more prevalent. And it's a set of beliefs where individuals attach irrational significance to race. And as I mentioned, that what we've seen recently is this whole movement of Black Lives Matter has again raised to the fore these issues of racism that's really not really gone away, whether you're looking at it in the US, whether you're looking at it in South Africa, from my perspective, or in Europe, as I'm going to share with you. I mean, it's just so endemic in society at the moment. But I start with Black Lives Matter because we've seen how this movement has sparked massive protests worldwide. And when I was starting to look at some of the context for this, and I was looking at this paper on racism in sports and ethics, primarily in the US, and it was a 1996 paper, and I compared it with some of the stats for 2020, and the situation hasn't changed much. And so we've got to see Black Lives Matter within the context of what African Americans are experiencing in the US currently, where unemployment is at twice the rate. They earn, in comparison, 59% to every $1 earned by whites. The median incomes are 1/10 of that. The schooling, the education, you know, in terms of the neighborhoods experiencing crimes, drugs, you know, poor schooling, poverty is rife. The consequences of all of this is that incarceration, although the rates are falling, it's still higher, and this persistent segregation leads to this large disparities in education and the consequent impacts, economic impacts. So when we look at this scenario in the US and translate that into the sporting environment, that despite all these massive protests happening around the world, it hasn't changed much in terms of the sporting context of these incidents still occurring. So I'm going to very quickly talk about some positives that have come out of Black Lives Matter, and then come back to this aspect of a lot has not changed, right? So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the social justice network that emerged in South Africa within the context of cricket in South Africa. In the wake of George Floyd, there were very prominent Black South African cricketers, former cricketers, who only started sort of raising their voice and raising the issues and the challenges that they faced while they were playing a cricket, elite cricket at a national level in terms of playing for South Africa. And so what it did do, though, is that it led to this commission where players could come forward, very similar to what we had in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where players could then come forward and really just tell their stories and let their voices be heard. So it led to this commission which underscored that systemic racism still existed in cricket, as it does in sport in South Africa. So nearly 30 years after the end of apartheid and the first our first democratic elections in 1994, we are still faced with this challenge, very much as is the US faced with this challenge, in terms of athletes still experiencing incidents of racism, and then across the world. So I've just noted a couple of incidences here in terms of the wake of George Floyd killing in May 2020. We have an incident with Neymar playing playing in France a PSG match where he's called a monkey. And then, of course, those of us who follow football, who watched watched the Euros, which was because of COVID only played in 2021. We see Kylian Mbappe being faced with online abuse. We see another sort of controversial episode in sport of whether to take the knee or not to take the knee, and what the implications are if you don't take the knee. And we see half of the Italian team who took the knee before their game. And then, of course, this ugliness of racism, particularly rearing its head when teams lose. I've read several quotes of players who either they're the national hero when the team is winning. Lukaku saying he's being reported of a Belgian descent, or the Belgian player, and then when when he loses, he's the Belgian player of Congolese descent, or I think it was Mesut Ozil also, he was German when they were winning, but he was an immigrant when they were losing. And of course, those of us would remember the finals when England played Italy, and we had these young players brought on the field, Rashford, Sancho, and Saka, and they unfortunately all missed their penalties, and they were subjected to this anti-Black racist abuse. So very, 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 very telling how this rears its head, particularly when teams loses, how players then become the other. So, given the context, my little bit of history of South Africa and playing sport during apartheid, a little bit of Black Lives Matter, and moving this conversation closer to us in terms of Qatar and the World Cup and what it could mean in terms of Islamophobia. So I've recently come back from a conference which kind of tends to look at the darker side of sport, corruption, doping, and of course Qatar is high on the agenda for human rights abuses, workers' rights, but very, very little was said about how this could actually be an opportunity to address some of the challenges of Islamophobia. Here, for the first time, you have a World Cup which is predominantly held in the Western world, being hosted in a Muslim and Arab country for the first time, you know, and how this may actually lead to some other positive changes that gets very, very little coverage, you know. So when we look at Muslims in particular, they could be harassed because of the faith and sometimes because of their race. Okay, and here we see, and it was mentioned in this conference as well, you know, that we so constantly focusing on what is perceived to be, you know, the negative aspects of the World Cup in Qatar, and not really focusing on maybe perhaps some of the more positive aspects to come out of it, including addressing issues of Islamophobia. So in terms of, we heard this morning a little bit about Christian ethics, but this in a very similar way, in terms of Islamic ethics, Islam prohibits discrimination on any grounds, and given that Qatar is a Muslim state, it is expected that discrimination may be less organized during the World Cup. And coming back to football again, and you know, racial discrimination is so rife that in the last you know, 2 finals, both in Europe and in Africa, the AFCON, more than half of the players experienced abuse, online abuse, to the extent that for the first time during the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar and beyond, artificial intelligence is going to be used to counter hate speech, and this technology has been embraced by several stakeholders, and so we will see the impacts of this and maybe some of the positive outcomes of this in terms of trying to address this particular challenge, and I sincerely hope that we will see a positive change to the better in terms of people actually coming to Qatar to experience a World Cup in another location, which happens to be a Muslim country, and being exposed to the country, the culture, that it may have some positive spin-offs to reduce Islamophobia. So when I was preparing for this presentation and looking at some of the research, I came across this very, very interesting study. And it centered around Mohamed Salah and Liverpool. But it was also very interesting that not to the same extent, and I'll just give you a brief synopsis of what the study focused on, but so not to the same extent, but there seems to be some kind of generalization that potentially may be possible, because very similar reductions were seen in relation to Sadio Mane, who's the other Muslim player, but not as visible as Mohamed Salah. So let me briefly tell you about this case by this researchers that were done from Stanford University, together with colleagues from Yale University and the University of Colorado. So they looked to see whether exposure to celebrities like Mohamed Salah can reduce prejudice by exploring this this case, which was so as opposed to in a and not in a natural setting, where this is a real sort of live case of the parasocial contact hypothesis. So it's about having exposure and contact with the other, if this will lead to a more sort of a generalized, more positive feelings and reducing prejudice against Muslim people as a whole, through this contact with Mo Salah. So this is as on the graph here, it's showing that he had agreed to transfer in 2017, and these are the issues of a crime reported in the UK, and so they looked at counterfactuals in the rest of the UK, and then they looked at Liverpool, given where the club is based, and how the incidences of bigotry reduced based upon his signing, and they then looked at the Twitter feeds of these of the fans, of the Liverpool fans, and they've seen that it demonstrated that positive and sustained exposure to Mo Salah was likely to reduce the hate crime and anti-Muslim speech. So when he agreed to transfer in 2017, we know that at the time, just in those initial years of success when he joined, that Liverpool had that decisive victory over Porto in 2018, and then the fans came up with these chants. As you can see, it's very much about him being a Muslim. That's even acknowledged by the coach, Jurgen Klopp, to say, his religiosity is a very strong component of who he is, and players got exposed to him prostrating on the floor, sujooding on the floor, and acknowledging his strong faith as a Muslim. And then these chants then also continued into the season with as you can see here, featuring being Muslim, a gift from Allah, etc. So we often look at celebrities and how they can be positive or negative influences on society and as role models. But here's this case of this parasocial contact hypothesis, which seems to indicate that this one particular individual, a celebrity, can have some kind of influence on reducing this bigotry, or in terms of a broader level of Islam. So that was the Mo Salah case. So I know Dries also touched on some of ethical theories in his talk this morning, as well as Christos in terms of utilitarianism. So can we look at ethics and an ethical perspective to reduce some of this racial prejudice and discrimination we find? And of course, there are different theories of ethics, and they all have, you know, the advantages, and sometimes, you know, it works against one when one is looking at in terms of utilitarianism and it's for the greatest good, but it can lead to sacrificing some minorities, for example. And also when you look at Kantianism, its ethical understanding must be made in a way in which they could actually be promoted for all, with a true respect for all individuals. But then it can also leave us to be quite inflexible, it doesn't quite fully explain, you know, who determines what is right, what is wrong, you know, who makes those moral judgments. But these theories are not there, and whether we're looking at Christian ethics or Islamic ethics, you know, it's not to say whether one of these is better than the other, but that for us to question, you know, and to acknowledge that when, and also translating that into sport, you know, that we have a moral obligation and we have moral values, you know, that we have to act ethically. So when we're looking at sport, not just from the athlete's perspective, so, you know, when I raise the whole issue of sort of Black Lives Matter and the issues that athletes are facing, we also look at racial prejudice and discrimination from a management perspective. Because if you look at the global sporting world, and if you look at how many coaches of color are in management positions or coaching positions across the world, across the league, we find challenges, you know. So whether we're looking at from the athlete perspective, the management perspective, coaching, you know, we have to acknowledge that acting ethically must be more detailed and comprehensive than doing what one thinks is right. It's a lot more complex, you know, but it's important, you know, that we think about this as you know, Christos was talking in terms of a business, in terms of being CSR, and you know, and in the same way, when we're looking at ethics in sport, in terms of addressing racial discrimination, you know, that we have a morality and that people generally act in accordance with it. So when we look at sport and ethics, there's really three ways in which we can engage. It can be negative, when you get people cheating, they're acting immorally, where sport can have no moral significance, or there's a connection between playing sport and the development of moral value. And as, again, sorry, Christos, you went before me and you were raising some of these issues, so I'm going to mention it again. We generally think of sport as good. And so I would like to see, you know, that we do look at sport as being good and assisting in developing moral values, but we also need to make more of a difference. And I think if we all, you know, can apply this to our behavior in sport, whether we, you know, whether we are those in management or in our, you know, in other disciplines that link to sport, perhaps we will be in a better place. Okay, so in terms of sport, how this translates is how all participants should act in the most ethically desirable manner. So whether we're looking at the key virtues of fairness, integrity, responsibility, and respect, it all emerges from being ethical. And to eliminate racism, it's most important to give respect to everyone, regardless of color or race. So just coming back to sort of concluding remarks on this, racism of any kind is unethical, and we should treat others in ways that doesn't harm or devalues them. And so we have to act in an ethically responsible manner, and particularly to address those unconscious forms of racism. We have to have recognition of the problem and a commitment to ethical solutions in order to reduce racism in sports. And as indicated, there are many ethical theories and perspectives in terms of dealing with this, including in terms of Islam teachings of eradicating all forms of racial discrimination. And just to highlight, and again, I'm not the expert, I think there are other experts that can add more to this. This was just in terms of some of my own readings in terms of ethics and Islam and sport. You know, when the Prophet's message was clear to entire humanity that no Arab has no superiority over non-Arab or non-Arab or vice versa, and white over black or vice versa, except by piety and good action. Okay, and I think the lesson there is that, you know, is that we can all be treated equally, and this challenges the Western mindset of being superior. And it's also a way that I really do think that we can address some of the challenges we face in sport, particularly in the Western media, of how Qatar and the World Cup is being viewed, and that it can be used as a catalyst to diminish both racial and religious discrimination. And I think I've covered basically all of this, and I think it's very important that us as sports managers, you know, that we in our teachings and with our students, that we raise these issues about ethical awareness and education, because it's up to each one of us to make that difference. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Camilla, also for addressing this very important, sensitive, and critical issue in sport ethics. And I think your presentation was quite expansive in going through also the history of the interplay of sports and racism and racial discrimination. Again, I open the floor for discussion. I already have a raised hand from Dr. Christos, so we can directly start, please.
Thank you, Camilla. Just what is your view? No, let me position first my observation. We expect to connect your presentation with the previous one, with mine. We expect from executives, from managers within corporations, to behave and demonstrate their social behavior and ethical manner, fashion, and we expect that the highly paid executives, most of the times well-educated through MBAs, you know, MBA programs, et cetera, where they have been taught, you know, these things. So we expect all this kind of behavior from them. When it comes to especially top athletes, like the case that you mentioned, Mo Salah, and others from other sports as well, whether to knee or not, to take a stance in front of 60,000 people. I feel that if we expect from these, by and large, young people, 23, 24, 25, who are highly exposed, right, in some events across the globe, to take a position on a very sensitive matter, right, it is perhaps too much of a task, because these young athletes, young in terms of age, right, maybe they haven't been taught, they never had the opportunity to educate themselves about those sensitive matters. And their captain, just before they come off the tunnel, for the game to start, she asks, now we have to knee against this and that, or in support of this and that, right? And I'm part of the team, and I say, what is all about? What happened? Because it happens not to be aware of what is happening and what we are, supporting for, or we are against for, or whatever, right? So are we expecting too much from those athletes sometimes? Should we expect from those athletes who are highly exposed to take a stance, to have a thesis on sensitive ethical and unethical issues that keep us busy, and most of them have been mentioned in your presentation? Are we asking too much? And what is, and I'm connecting that with the very last points that you mentioned, the importance of the education, of educating those people, those athletes, before they make these kind of statements, because they might be good for the society, or maybe bad for their careers, depending on what happens after they make a statement of that nature. Sorry for my long. I just wanted to put everything into context. Thank you.
It's highly complex, so it's going to take a long time for you to say what you want to. I think it's highly complex because we can talk about the Colin Kaepernick case and what happened to his career and the implications for him. We can talk about people being asked just before they go on to the match, and I explored this in terms of cricket. We had South African cricketers not wanting to take the knee and the backlash they faced because of not taking the knee. And then you can take the knee and it can be completely what's the word I'm looking for, meaningless, just doing for the sake of doing it, So for me, I think it's education. I have to remind myself, that my kids and the generation of my kids actually don't know what happened in South Africa. I constantly share with my children what we lived through, where we are today because of what we experienced. But I'm sure in many other families that never had my experience, those kids don't know what happened. So for me, it's education is so important. But teams and clubs need to make that commitment so that you don't have those incidents. And that's where I call Cricket South Africa to account. They can't be asking the captain just before the match, okay, now everybody must take the knee. That needs to happen prior, have strategies for your match and how you're going to win your match. players need to know how they need to present their country and represent their country. So I think it's all part of the education process, and knowing, you know, what may potentially be some of the implications based on what decisions you decide to make, you know. And interestingly, in that article, one of the points that were made was that possibly there were certain criteria that Mo Salah met in order to demonstrate this parasocial contact hypothesis. But one of the discussion points was that, you know, he's religious, but he's not sort of, he's never made any kind of political statements in the past, you know, and maybe that is why he is so popular, you know. And then again, on the other hand, you know, the athletes, I'm just thinking, you know, out loud as you're asking me the question here, but like then there are other athletes who are very vocal, you know, in terms of their causes, you know, speaking out, Lewis Hamilton, etc., you know, but they also then attract a certain following because, you know, they are vocal about their causes. But I think at the end of the day, I think athletes and emerging athletes and athletes coming through the rank, I think it's a very critical part of education.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Dr. Amara.
Thank you, Camila, for the presentations. And it's, you know, when we talk about South Africa, you know, coming from Africa as well, so it's it resonates with me, and being as well Algerian, but he lived in Britain as a member of ethnic minority. But I think what wanted to say is sports is the way that it claims to be universal. Is it in itself ethnocentric? You know, which leads to discrimination. For example, I mean, Qatar was criticized not because it's you know, is an Arab and Muslim country, but because it's also different from the norm that we know about sports, that is defined by maybe Eurocentrism. So we need that is for the sports system to reconcile with its diversity and accept diversity. Then we can resolve the question of discrimination.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I agree with you. You know, it's accepting this diversity of sport. I wasn't in the presentation because I was presenting at the same time. I was in the legacy presentation, and there was the third of 3 Qatar World Cup panels at Play the Game, and another colleague who's just recently, he's American, but he's written a book about FIFA and sort of FIFA, or his area of expertise is FIFA corruption, but you know, giving alternative views on sort of what is happening in Qatar, and he was presenting in that slot, and Mahfoud, as you know, Play the Game attracts also a lot of journalists, you know, and there was somebody who made the comment that supporting the World Cup in Qatar is akin to supporting apartheid in South Africa. And you know, on that day, I had my FIFA World Cup shirt on with my South African beads. So you know, just to make that comparison, me living through apartheid, you know, I said, you know, he just doesn't know what he's talking about, you know, and living in South Africa and living in Qatar, you know. So until we can switch lenses, until we can have different experiences, you know, trying to get to that point to acknowledge this diversity in sport and diversity in worldviews will always be a constant struggle, I think.
This reminds me of Christos' concept of this legitimacy gap. So I think that there is a legitimacy gap in terms of how sport system is claiming to be universal, but in practice doesn't accept maybe diversity.
Okay, thank you. I don't see questions in the chat. If I hope I'm not missing anything. Also, I don't see raised hands. So I take the opportunity to raise a question about the discrimination. You mentioned the examples you mentioned. It looks like they are examples from outside the core sport system or the core sport organization. So it's coming from the fans, for instance, especially from other clubs, against the competing players from the competing clubs, which we can say here discrimination is instrumentalized. If this player is playing for their own team, we don't know what they will say about this player. But there are practices, at least we hear of them, and Dr. Amara speak about the ethnic group, the minorities of ethnic groups in specific European countries. The players speak about discriminatory practices while they are playing to climb the ladder of stardom. To be important players, we lose many down the road because of their color, because of their they make part of ethnic minorities. So we lose many. Do we have any research results or statistics about that kind of practices in the sport, or is it just impressionistic feelings?
No, you're absolutely right. And maybe I probably wasn't that clear in my example of when I was talking about the social justice network. It was many of the players of color in South Africa. So I'll just go back to South Africa and then I'll talk about some other examples of where cricketers, Black South Africans, either felt that they were discriminated against in terms of, so they made the national team, so they were part of the team, but when it came to select those 11 players, they were either making up the numbers, because at some stages in South Africa's history they had to have quota players, so there had to be a certain number of players, or they were discriminated against because of those numbers. So they were only in the team to make up the numbers and they weren't there on merit or performance. Or it was a case of players not making it, like making it to that level, but then white players were picked because of who the coaching staff was or who the selection committee was, white players being picked above black players not being good enough. So there, but not being good enough. And so you find in South Africa, I'm just going to talk South Africa first, that across the board, in terms of other sports, whether it was sort of rugby or hockey or other sports, where you still find many players of color feeling that they were ignored, you know, because of this discrepancy in who the coaching staff was or the management staff. So very similar in terms of what you mentioned, in terms of what Mahfoud, if you look at in terms of the migration of footballers from Africa to Europe, as an example, and the challenges, there's always extra challenges, extra burdens for these players, and that in many instances it is a question of racial discrimination, where players may not make it to the levels that they could because of that.
Thank you so much. If we don't have other burning questions that we need to address, let me check everything again before, and I don't see any raised hands. If any of the colleagues want to say anything just before we wrap up, please feel free to unmute yourself and talk. Otherwise, I just have to thank all the speakers of today. Very rich food stuff to think about that makes us at least intellectually, if not physically fit for thinking more about these complex issues and ethical dilemmas. And I'm very much looking forward to the second day by getting more insights and thoughts about these topics, which also help us as a research center, as CILE, to think about the future and how we can enhance this research area within the emerging field of Islamic ethics with the help of great figures and impactful researchers like yourselves, together with possibly other colleagues. So thank you very much for the proceedings of today. And tomorrow we will start as per the schedule. We start at 11 o'clock, and 11 o'clock here means Doha time. Hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow at 11 o'clock Doha time. Thank you very much for all your contributions, for those who raised questions, for those who were kind enough to respond to these questions. Thank you very much. Have a great day and see you tomorrow, inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you.